Before I jump into things, I wanted to apologize for the wait between the last video and this one. Again. Oops. Though videos haven't been being produced, I have still been working hard on other aspects of this project, most of which are going to be announced at the end of this video. So please watch until the end. There may just be a free game in it for you if you do. Anyway, in the free time I managed to scramble together during my hiatus, I replayed the Mass Effect trilogy. Femshep and Garrus for the win. And it reminded me how much I truly enjoy actual role-playing in my games, and on a sadder note, how often it is poorly implemented. I played from Mass Effect 1 to about halfway through Mass Effect 3 before suffering burnout from playing the games non-stop, but my desire for role-playing still hadn't been sated. Since options continued to evade me, I hit up my old friend Google, searching for the other games that allow for role-playing and lasting consequences. All the usual titles came up: Planescape Torment, Baldur's Gate, Neverwinter Nights, all classics, but not really what I was in the mood for. After a bit more digging, I finally stumbled upon a more unique-sounding title to fill the void: Artifact Adventure. The game promised to be the ultimate mix of classic aesthetics and modern open-world RPG, where every quest has multiple ways to complete it and the choices you make always have repercussions. This sounded perfect. Perhaps even too good to be true. Upon a bit more digging, I learned the game was made using RPG Maker, which was an immediate red flag for me. But in the end, curiosity won out and I tried the game anyway. Does it live up to its claims? Well, let's find out. Or not. Before the game even began, I found a hurdle to overcome: getting the game to work with a controller. The keyboard configuration didn't really feel right, with the arrows being used for movement instead of the now standard WASD config, and there were no means of reconfiguring the controls in-game. Alright, PC usually offers ways around these kinds of pitfalls. I immediately began looking for an alternative, which led me to reading that there's Xbox 360 controller support. So I plugged mine in, only to find that the game natively recognized the controller, but still had a poor layout that made the X button confirm for some reason. Okay. Now it's getting personal. After a half hour or so of fiddling around with the game, I finally found an ideal solution: using my NES controller with a PC adapter in conjunction with the Joy-to-Key software. This ended up being the perfect solution, as not only did the button layout work, but I got to experience the game in the way it feels like it was intended, just as if it were a game programmed for the NES. While I know most of this is a personal problem and I could have just suffered with the PC controls and been done with it, I do feel it is important to point this issue out for other potential gamepad users. It's not going to affect my breakdown of the game in this review, it's just a warning for those who may fall in the same trap. Now finally onto the game, I swear. After being given the option to pick 4 characters out of total 6 character classes, you will enter the game. You'll be presented with an old school JRPG that will leave genre fans feeling right at home. Mostly because Artifact Adventure follows the Dragon Quest formula to a T. When I first started playing, I really enjoyed the nostalgic vibes the game was giving me, but as I continued on, I couldn't help but feel that it was a bit lacking. The battles include some highly detailed static enemy sprites that range from captivating to outright grotesque, which are all worthy of praise, but they sit on a pure black background with nothing but a list of stats for your own characters with no images to represent them. On top of this, there are no battle animations in the game either, so whether you are casting a spell or using a weapon, all you'll see is an enemy flicker when it's hit. While the minimalistic battle screens were palatable, the graphical presentation outside of combat left more to be desired. The first town looked great, but as you travel, you'll realize every town uses the exact same tile set. Once you've seen a couple of the game's locations, you've effectively seen them all, and while I at first felt it was nitpicking when I came to this conclusion, I remembered that the game's primary focus is exploration, and a large appeal of exploration, like it or not, is seeing new and interesting things. The music suffers from the same basic issues. The compositions are decent, and I find a couple of the songs catchy, but there just aren't nearly enough of them, and they become rather repetitive by the time I reach the end of my 12-hour adventure. Perhaps I went in with too high of expectations, but I do feel the game's presentation would have benefited from just a touch more effort and variety. That's not to say that it was bad, just average. Perfectly, blandly average. But as we all know, presentation is far from the most important aspect of a game's design, and that is definitely the truth here. Artifact Adventure is definitely an open world. From the very beginning, you can travel almost anywhere you'd like, with the only thing impeding your progress being high-level monsters that you may run into if you go in the wrong direction. There were many times where I'd wander into a location my party couldn't yet handle, only to die and be sent back to town. I never found this infuriating and never felt the need to grind, because whenever I did find myself out of my league, I'd simply walk in a different direction and find a new questline to follow. It should be noted that in Artifact Adventure, combat serves as more of a roadblock than it does a challenge to overcome. The combat mechanics aren't deep enough to create an engaging experience on their own. In fact, for the majority of the game, I'd use the auto battle mechanics as I played, but the fact that combat moved so quickly made it so I didn't care that it wasn't engaging. To me, it felt kind of like Half-Minute Hero, for those of you whom have played that title, and if you haven't, you really should, it's addicting as all hell. The combat is a hurdle. It shows whether or not your characters are ready to explore the area you have traveled to, and if you're continually dying, you'll just have to come back later. Now, that's not to say I never took the reins. During several of the boss battles, especially late game, I had to micromanage or I would have stood no chance. But just don't expect the combat to be all that captivating. It's important to note that in this game, combat is more of a formality than it is the focus, but the developer seems to be aware of that and structured the game accordingly. The combat is used as a guide to show you where you should be exploring, and that is where the key focus of the game lies. While the freedom to explore is the game's driving focus, it's the quests themselves that make it memorable. And surprisingly, a lot of the quests are just as open as the game world is. I ran into several occasions where the quests can be completed in numerous ways. While I was trying to avoid spoiling any of this game's quests, I feel I have to give at least one example so you know what I mean. There's a quest in the game where you learn of 2 warring factions of crabs. Yes, crabs. Each side offers you a rare piece of equipment passed down throughout their clan for generations if you help them kill the opposite leader. That alone gives you 2 options. But it is not your only choice. If you are well-traveled enough, you may have run into a man in a completely different town who wants to make his village more famous and requests for you to bring him crab meat so he can make a famous dish to bring tourists all throughout the land. All 3 of these are viable options. You could sympathize with one crab or the other, collecting whichever piece of equipment you find more valuable, or you could just kill them both for their meat. After all, they are just crabs, right? Another interesting aspect of the gameplay is that completing quests actually gives you experience as well as fighting battles. While not entirely uncommon in the realm of RPGs, it is something I'm not used to experiencing in an RPG of this style. And it made seeking out these quests all the more addicting because of it. Now on the downside for a lot of players, there isn't much to the main plot. When the game begins, you are told that the Swamp King is destroying the world and your goal is to stop it. That's really all there is to it. But as the saying goes, it's about the journey, not the destination. Artifact Adventure actually makes true on this adage, not just in the traditional sense with exploration and combat, but with the multiple decision points throughout that truly do affect your entire experience. In fact, the very first thing you do in the game is choose one of 3 options. Number 1, you can obtain artifacts that permanently increase the stats of your party members. Number 2, you can gain the Key of Time, which allows you to enter several shrines throughout the game that contain some of the most powerful equipment in the game. Or, number 3, you can gain access to an airship from the very beginning that makes traveling much easier. This is the choice I made, by the way. In a single playthrough, it is impossible to ever gain access to these other options after making your first decision, and this is just one of many examples of your choices genuinely having consequences. The game also contains a number of moral dilemmas, as is to be expected, but unlike a lot of games containing these types of scenarios, you aren't given all of the information required for each choice unless you truly search for it, and sometimes not even then. You know, like how many decisions have to be made in real life. You aren't necessarily making a correct or incorrect decision in any of these moments, but their effects will be felt somewhere in the future. The moral ambiguity presented in many of this game's decisions had a larger impact on me than the choices presented in games like Mass Effect, in large part because the decisions weren't gamified into a Paragon or Renegade action that paints your party into some unrealistic role. Let's face it, sometimes drastic decisions have to be made by good people. Alternatively, sometimes good deeds can lead to misunderstandings that cause negative consequences in the long run, and you will never truly know which is what until you reach the game's ending and the results of your actions are laid before you. And this is the real reason to play Artifact Adventure. It is done so brilliantly, and I could see the connection between all of my actions and their results clearly. Even the good deeds that turned sour felt plausible, and it instilled the thought in me that many other games have failed to. It reminded me that my characters, these tiny 8-bit representations of heroes, were just people, that they weren't perfect, and that their actions could have very well done as much harm as they did good. So often in books, movies, games, the heroes become figures of legend. All of their bad deeds are looked over and their good deeds prevail, but in real life, that isn't always the case. And they took this simple indie RPG to remind me of that. Well, there you have it. Artifact Adventure does indeed live up to its claims. Admittedly, the Dragon Quest clone base of the title is its weakest element, which would have left it as a rather generic addition to its genre, but luckily that's not all the game set out to accomplish. The fact that this indie title explored choice in gaming better than most AAA games that use it as its selling point is almost mind-blowing. Artifact Adventure is a rather unique example of a game's gimmick being enough to heighten its quality from a mediocre title to one that every gamer should play, and I highly suggest you check it out. I know I will again one of these days. Well, thank you all for watching. Next time, we're starting the big one. That's right, the first entry of Stiles series synopsis of Final Fantasy. And as I mentioned earlier, that's not my only exciting announcement. I may have been gone for a while, but it hasn't mean I haven't been working. Stiles Reviews now has its very own website. This is exciting because it's a place for me to archive all of my content in one place, my written and video content, as well as giving you all the way to get in touch with me if you are so inclined. On top of that, I just spent the last few days finishing up what can loosely be called my studio, meaning that I will be showing myself on camera once again. I figured it was appropriate since Final Fantasy is so important to me, and I figured it deserved a more personal touch, even if I am admittedly a bit camera phobic. Now, for waiting so patiently, here's the news on that free game I mentioned earlier. I have a copy of Okami HD for the PlayStation 3 that I'll be giving away by the end of September. Unfortunately, this code will only work for players with PSN access in North America and Canada, but if you meet that qualification, it can be all yours. All you have to do is leave a comment on this video. And in fact, how about any of my other videos? For each comment you leave, I will give you one more chance to win. I'll enter them all into a random number generator, and the winner will be given the code. That's all for now. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you next time with Stiles' series synopsis of Final Fantasy.